Well, welcome everybody. This is the 10th and final webinar in the series, Considerations and Strategies for Running Clinical Trials During the COVID-19 Pandemic. My name is Shelley Dyer and I'm the CEO of ARCS. I'm a little bit sad today. I can't believe that we've gone through 10 of these webinars, but we have. It's just flown by. So I don't know if you heard the news or read my newsletter last week, but our first speaker, Jenny Hertz from BioIntellect, was talking about COVID vaccine, but was embargoed from mentioning the first-in-man vaccine that they were involved in, her company Novatech. Anyway, that happened the day after. I did share some data from global data about the number of trials underway in Australia. It's so great to see so many research teams working on vaccines here in Australia. But anyway, look back to the webinar. Yeah, can you believe it was the 23rd of March was our first webinar. When we put the series together, we had the concept that we were going to do it to share knowledge and information, identify practical and pragmatic solutions to support clinical trial sites as all parties work together to mitigate the effects on clinical trial patients until the COVID situation eases. So this 10th in the series is really the perspective from the patient, and it's really anchoring the series for us in a very positive way, I feel. But before we get any further, I just wanted to go to the next slide, Joe, and just acknowledge our sponsors. We've had MTP Connect and New South Wales Health sponsoring us through the series, and we're very pleased to have representatives from both of those organisations here today. So we have firstly Rebecca Tunstall, who's the Senior Director Stakeholder Engagement from MTP Connect. She's going to say a few words to us. Beck, over to you.
Thanks, Shani, and good morning, everyone. MTP Connect has been really pleased to have sponsored this important ARCS COVID-19 webinar series. It's been a valuable series to support the ongoing work of the clinical trial sector in Australia. So congratulations to Shani, ARCS and the team for pivoting so quickly to get this series up and running. Since the webinar started at the end of March, this free webinar series has helped to support the clinical trial community as this pandemic emerged here and within the region. So it's been really important across the whole sector. So as we come to terms with the new ways of working and sharing information, it's been great to see this virtual platform helping to continue the collaboration during this challenging time for many people across the sector. And I suppose with this final episode today, focusing on clinical trial participants, it's important to acknowledge that clinical trials ultimately serve patients through early access to new treatments or improving standards of care for the community as well. So we thank the patients for their contribution to the research required to develop new medicines and treatments. So thank you to everyone for your efforts, and we've had so many people input into the seminar series. So now I'll hand it back to Shani, and looking forward to today's webinar.
Great, thanks very much, Beck. And I also have online Shelley Burnett, who is a Senior Project Officer for Clinical Trials New South Wales, part of the Office of Health and Medical Research at New South Wales Health, is also going to say a few words. Thanks, Shelley.
Thanks, Shani, and thank you to ARCS for hosting this series and for all the speakers who've contributed the excellent content so far. I've been attending all of them, and it's been a fantastic way to stay informed of all the ways the sector has been innovating and adapting to the challenges of COVID-19. I work in Clinical Trials New South Wales, and we're part of New South Wales Health Office for Health and Medical Research, and we've been really pleased to be part of the support for this webinar series. As a very, very quick plug, our unit's here to support clinical trials in New South Wales. We've got a range of services open to the entire sector. So please contact us on Clinical Trials New South Wales at health.newsouthwales.gov.au, or just pop onto our website at medicalresearch.newsouthwales.gov.au. And we're here to help you connect with site sponsors, assist in negotiating roadblocks, and provide information on supporting the high quality conduct of clinical trials in New South Wales. So please feel free to get in touch with any questions or concerns you have about your trials. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Shelley. Fantastic. So again, thank you so much to both MTP Connect and New South Wales Government, whose support has been invaluable in being able to provide these webinars to you all for free. So next slide, just to the housekeeping. The session today is going to be a slightly different format, but please get those questions coming in to the speakers, put them through as you think of them, and we'll get to them towards the end. So again, no recording. We will be recording this session, so it will be available on our website, the same as the other sessions that we've had. Interestingly, some of the recordings, different recordings, have been accessed over 1,000 times per recording. So again, I think a very valuable resource that people access at the time that they need it. So next slide, thanks, Joe. Again, I think I've said this before, but for up-to-date information, go to your state or federal health services, so www.health.gov.au for everything you need in relation to up-to-date information. Next slide, Joe. And here we are, the end of the series. Now, really, if there is a desire to have more in the series, I know my team will kill me, but please let us know if it would be useful for you, or if there's other things that you think that we could do. I'm happy to help you there. But yeah, this is the 10th in the series. So on the next slide, again, with the support of MTP Connect and New South Wales Health, ARCS has been able to deliver this, but we are an association of professionals in this sector, and we're a voice for you. So the best way you can support us at this stage is to join us as an organisation and get behind what we do and how we do it and how responsive we are for you. So please do that. Okay, next slide, Joe. So I will hand over now to Janelle Bowden, who is the Managing Director and Consultant for Access CR. She's going to be managing and chairing the sessions with the speakers today. So I will hand over to Janelle. Thank you very much, Janelle.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks to ARCS for inviting me to lead the session today. Before I introduce our speakers today, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which you and I find ourselves today, and to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present and emerging, as well as any Indigenous people joining the call today. For those of you who don't know me, I've been working in and around clinical trials around 20 years now, and for much of that time, I've been interested in listening to and exploring the experience of patients, carers and trial participants, and how to involve them in our work to help address the issues that they and we have in clinical research. Over the last 9 weeks, ARCS has shared the perspectives and experiences of many stakeholders of clinical research during the pandemic. And I'm pleased that they've chosen to wrap up the series by bringing it back to those that are at the very heart of clinical trials. Can I have the next slide, please? They're the trial participants, a subset of the broader community that hope to benefit from what we do in clinical research. The pandemic hit pretty fast, and an enormous amount of collaboration has been required to keep clinical trials on track and to put in place short-term acceptable practices to address staff and participant safety. But to what extent have we been proactively communicating with trial participants and involving health consumers in the higher level problem solving around the processes that we've put in place at this time? Are we taking the community on us with us as we innovate in this space, both for the pandemic and beyond? And when things are almost changing daily, is it even possible to include another stakeholder group in the discussions? Should we? But what are the risks if we don't? These are some of the questions I hope we're going to explore today. And so without further ado, I would like to welcome our three speakers, David Young, Associate Professor Stephen Tong, and Anne McKenzie, whom I'll introduce as we come to speak together. Today's format will be a little bit different. Each of the speakers and I are going to have a Q&A to understand their experiences of this time. For David, I will invite questions at the end of his chat, as he may not be able to stay, but for the others, I will keep their questions until the end. So next slide, please. So let me kick off by welcoming David Young. David is a Byron Bay-based photographer who was diagnosed with a rare form of non-Hodgkin lymphoma in 2012. He's currently almost in remission whilst being on a clinical trial of a new oral targeted therapy drug. He's what I'd call an empowered consumer and uses his experience to help others with cancer, actively initiating and contributing to a number of cancer support groups, as well as advising organisations aiming to support people with cancer. So David, thanks for joining me today and sharing your experiences with me and those listening. If at any time a question you're uncomfortable with, please just let me know and we'll move on.
Sure.
So would you mind sharing with those listening how you came to be involved in your trial? Was it something you went looking for or your doctors presented to you, and had you ever thought about clinical trials before you were unwell?
Sure, thanks, Janelle. And just before I start, thank you, everyone. It's a real sort of honour to be part of the Australian medical system and to be supported by it. So generally speaking, I think most people feel it's pretty damn good. So just a thank you to all those involved in that out there. To answer your question, so initially with a clinical trial, I hadn't considered clinical trials initially because I had the misconception that it would be a placebo versus a drug, and I always thought that felt a bit strange, and I've only since learnt that that's not necessarily the case in a clinical trial. And they're much more flexible than that. And you've, of course, got the 3 stages. I found out about my clinical trial, which is run by a Chinese company called Beijing, out of America and China. And it's a worldwide trial, phase 3 trial. I am on a forum for my specific disease, which has the wonderful name of Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia. I got an email as I was sitting in my local coffee shop saying there's a new clinical trial starting, and I looked at the website and saw it was ibrutinib versus zanubrutinib. I knew both drugs because I'd done my homework, and I immediately rang the Australian hospital that was involved, which was in Brisbane. They were quite surprised to hear from me because the clinical trial wasn't live yet, but I put my name down and got my haematologist to apply. It hadn't been discussed with me by either my haematologist or my doctor around, you know, you could try clinical trials. And I've since learnt that, you know, there's websites, you know, quite good websites and apps for clinical trials. And I recommend all my support group. I run 2 different support groups, and anyone I talk to, I recommend they keep in the email trail for those for clinical trials. let me see what I think. Does that answer the question, Janelle?
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you, David. So you've been participating in this trial now for 3 years, and it's going into an extension phase, which might be changing how it works anyway. But typically, before the pandemic hit, what did participating in the clinical trial kind of involve for you in terms of visits and procedures and whatnot?
For me, it was going up to Brisbane. I live in Byron Bay, so it was a 2.5-hour trip up to Brisbane once a month to get my bloods done and to see the haematologist in charge of the trial at the Princess Alexandria Hospital in Brisbane. And every 3 months I'd have a CT scan. Initially I had a bone marrow biopsy and full bloods, you know, each time I went up. So it wasn't too onerous. I got 3 months worth of the oral targeted therapy drug to go back down to Byron with. Yeah, it was you know, not too onerous. So that was generally the thing.
Great. So most of that was in person. So when the pandemic hit, how were you feeling in general about the pandemic? And did you have any immediate concerns about what would happen with the trial?
Yes, I was concerned about both of those things. My initial concern around the pandemic was obviously being having a low immune. Even though I'm relatively healthy, my immune system isn't, and so I was pretty concerned about that. I'm generally pretty positive, but I did have a sort of a meltdown after about a week of the whole COVID thing going off, and got quite concerned, and but I worked out that I was understandably simply, you know, worried about dying ultimately, and it took me a few days to get over that, and once I had got back to feeling normal, I've been fine since then. I did also have concerns around drug supply for the drug, because it comes from both China and America. But I rang up the trial nurse, who has been absolutely amazing, efficient and great support through the clinical trial. I can't praise her enough. And they didn't contact me. I had to contact them, which has been the case through the whole thing, which I think you had a question at some point about whether they have been proactive in contacting me. They haven't really, to be honest, but whenever I contact them, they have been, you know, they've answered all the questions to the best of their ability. My drug supply, they told me initially it shouldn't be a problem, although since then there has been one issue with the amount of drugs they can give me in one go. So I'm just keeping my fingers crossed that there's no more hiccups, but they tell me at this point it should be fine. Of course, you tend to become a little bit paranoid as a cancer sufferer and a trial participant, just because that is the nature of the beast. You know, you're worried that any small thing gets a bit exaggerated, whether it's you know, an itch on your forehead, or some minor illness that normally would be ignored. You worry that it might be something coming back or whatever. But otherwise, yeah, that's been the process.
And one of the things that you mentioned to me, I guess, from a practical level, you living in New South Wales and your trial site being in Queensland, was the border shutting presented a new anxiety for you?
Yes, initially, but as soon as the border closed, I just applied online for a exemption that came through immediately, and so that wasn't an issue. And then when I rang the hospital, they told me that they were going to organise a courier to send the drugs down to me, and I'd be having a phone conversation with the haematologist instead of a face-to-face. And instead of getting my bloods done up in Queensland, which was a red tape thing, they told me I couldn't get them done down here normally because of lack of communication. New South Wales, Queensland, don't get me started about that. They said you will be able to get them done in New South Wales, so that made life a lot easier. In fact, it's easier now than it was before, so I've got no complaint.
So have you been concerned at any time about any of the changes or how you've been communicating with the trial team?
No, not really. It's always, in a sense, it's always better to have a face-to-face, even though for me that's a 2.5 hour drive. I don't mind that personally, but you know, telephone conversation is better than nothing, and at least I know, you know, I can still contact them whenever I need to. They're always open to, you know, me talking to them. I've always felt listened to and welcomed, so no issues there.
Yeah. Well, that's great. If, given the audience that we have on the call today, who are largely clinical research professionals, if you had one or two things that you thought could have been done differently or improved as a trial participant at this time or at any time, do you have any thoughts on what they might be?
Sure. I guess around information initially, that would have been better to have had some information sent to me in the early days, but I guess everyone was scrambling to work it all out. But that would have been better. And maybe, yeah, going forward, I haven't, maybe just because I've been proactive in contacting them, they haven't felt the need to send me any extra info. I think one of the things that the clinical trial for me has been pretty good, so I haven't really got too many complaints. The things that I notice are generally system failures within any hospital, minor things like, you know, I got given a list of the drugs I was meant to be on that was someone else's drugs, that sort of thing, and you know, that sort of stuff. So, you know, you just keep your eye on what's going on. I've learned a lot being in the system. I've learned that you, ideally, if you're fragile, you need an advocate to come with you. I'm luckily not in that, don't feel I'm in that boat, but and I also just let people know they need to do their own homework and stay, you know, don't just let everyone else be in charge, as it were, take responsibility yourself. The consent form was a bit overly long. I had a 27-page consent form. I don't think that was great. I'm educated and reasonably, you know, savvy, but a lot of people would find that rather onerous and would just overwhelm them. So they, you know, I suggested a précis, a one-page précis at the beginning to allow people just to, you know, read the main points, and then if they wanted to go into more depth, they could then read the rest of the 27 pages. But I know the lawyers probably have a different opinion about that.
Yeah, it is something that I think the industry as a whole keeps wanting to address, but seemingly failing to do so.
Yeah, but look, it hasn't been a major consideration for me. I only had one issue, was that when I had to go off my drugs for a minor op, and I got severe withdrawal symptoms, and they had forgotten to tell me that I'd get withdrawal symptoms, which was a bit of an issue for 24 hours or so. But otherwise, I find they communicate pretty well. The trial nurse, as I said, is fantastic. The doctor is okay. I get to see a few different doctors, but the professor who I see is I trust, and yeah, no complaints really.
Well, thank you, David, for sharing that experience. I might ask Sue if we've had any questions for David before we move on to the next speaker, just in case David can't stay.
Hi, Janelle. No, not so far.
Not so far. Well, David, thank you for sharing that information. It's great that you've had a somewhat positive experience, and you're out there doing the work that you do to also share with other people the consideration of clinical trials. So thank you for that. And if you can stay, great. If you can't, thank you.
Thank you, Janelle.
There was just a question posted for David.
Okay.
Did you discuss with your original doctor about why they did not bring up the possibility of a clinical trial?
No, I don't think I did discuss that. Not with my original doctor or my original hematologist, because it wasn't until later that I sort of discovered how they work properly, I guess. So it wasn't, for me, it wasn't an issue initially. And yeah, no, I didn't tackle them with that question.
Thanks, David. Sue, anything else? So we should probably move on. We might actually just move on to, but thank you, David, for that.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
So now, thank you. So now I'd like to move on to flipping the discussion from the impact of this period on trial participants to the impact of consumers on some of the research that might be happening around COVID-19 treatments. And so to that end, I'd like to welcome Associate Professor Stephen Tong. Steve's an infectious diseases physician with the Victorian Institute Infectious Diseases Service and co-head of the Translational and Clinical Research and Indigenous Health cross-cutting disciplines at the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity. His research interests include skin pathogens, hospital infections, Indigenous health, viral hepatitis and influenza. And among his other responsibilities, he's co-lead of the Escott trial, which I'll be asking him about in a moment. So thank you, Stephen, for being involved in today's webinar.
Thanks, Janelle. Hi everyone. Hopefully you can hear me.
I can, thank you.
Good.
I'd like to begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about the design of the Escott trial.
Sure. So Escott is a randomised controlled trial involving patients who are hospitalised with COVID-19 but not sick enough to be in an intensive care unit. So we're looking at the group of patients who get COVID-19, need to be hospitalised. So it's not about those who are being looked after at home but aren't ventilated in the intensive care unit. And we're trialling two specific drugs. So lopinavir ritonavir, which is an HIV medication, and also hydroxychloroquine, which many of you will have heard of by now, I suspect, compared to the standard of care, which at this stage is supportive care in our hospital systems. So it's looking at those two drugs alone, the two drugs in combination compared to our current standard of care.
Thanks. And so it's been a rapidly evolving situation, and continues to evolve. How long has it taken? How long did it take for you to develop the protocol and get it launched, and kind of what types of collaborations have made those timelines possible?
Yeah, it's been obviously something like this. A clinical trial often takes, I don't know, 6 to 12 months usually to set up. In the face of a pandemic, clearly we didn't have that amount of time, and you could probably argue that even then we're a bit slow. But we needed to get together an investigator group, write a protocol. We probably started doing this during February, once it became increasingly clear that COVID-19 was going to hit Australia. And of course, at that time, we didn't have a good sense of how hard it might hit. So getting the protocol together, once that was done, getting a staff team. So we threw a lot of our non-COVID related staff members onto working on this. And it involved trying to get a collaborative group from all around Australia and New Zealand. So we didn't want it to be, just coming out of one institute or one hospital. We were really keen that as many hospitals as possible in Australia could be part of this. So contacted people around the country through various forums, and I think we have just over 80 hospitals who are at least have expressed a lot of interest and are in various processes of getting their governance signed up. And then submitting the protocol to ethics. So we went through Melbourne Health as the main ethics committee, and then through the National Mutual Agreement meant that most of our hospitals were signed up on that ethics, and now we need to approach the governance aspects. So all that took time, and then you've got to get funding, and unfortunately, in some ways, the main funding bodies in Australia, in terms of the NHMRC and also state level funding bodies, it's been pretty slow. So I think there was an MRFF core maybe 6 weeks ago now. We still haven't heard the outcomes from that. So it's been tricky to try and get funding. And in the end, we've really just relied on philanthropy and been able to raise $5 or $6 million towards Escott purely through philanthropy.
That's an extraordinary
and yeah, look, it's great generosity on the part of the funders, of course, but a lot of as you can imagine, a lot of behind the scenes work to engage with potential philanthropists and continue to engage with them as we've progressed. And so I guess going back to mid-February through to now, we gained ethics and then opened the first site for recruitment on April the 16th. And now have something like 14 sites open for recruitment and continuing to get the governance approvals for additional sites. And funding has also come through from the New Zealand government, and we have various other funding applications in Australian schemes as well.
Yeah, great. So I understand that you've had a consumer involved in the steering committee for the trial, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So from very early on, I think we had one steering committee meeting, and we kind of realised that it'd be really valuable and helpful to have a consumer representative on the steering committee. So we fairly quickly, I guess, made attempts to try and find someone appropriate, and went through the University of Melbourne. There's a thing called the Melbourne Academic Centre for Health, and they've done this kind of thing in the past. So we approached them for some advice, and they recommended we advertise through the Health Information Centre, the HIC. And through that, found a short list of potential consumers who could join the trial steering committee, and appointed someone within, I think it must have been within a week or two.
Yeah, great. So I know from first-hand experience you've also consulted with the National Consumer Advisory Group, which I'll be speaking with Anne about in a moment. How did you find out about that group? And given you already had a consumer on the steering committee, why would you choose to also engage with them?
So we found out it just happened that the chair of our trial steering committee works at the Telethon Kids Institute and has had I think, long-term connection with Anne and her group. And so Asha made the recommendation that we should approach Anne and engage with the consumer advisory group to provide further input into the trial and obtain some feedback about what we were planning.
So what did consulting with that group involve for you? What expectations did you have? Were there any challenges?
Yeah, look, I guess I was hoping that it would be a kind of collaborative effort where we could show what the protocol was looking like, what the consent and patient information forms would look like, and then discuss some of the perhaps more controversial aspects of that with a consumer group that so that I guess we had ideas of how we would like things to be done, and felt that it would be very helpful to get an idea from consumers as to as to what they thought of those various aspects. So, you know, one of the things was because of infection control issues and the need to use PPE and so on, we asked the ethics committee about the possibility of verbal consent, so rather than direct written consent. And the ethics committee were happy with that. You know, we were very keen that we not take pieces of paper in and out of patient rooms with the potential for contamination of those pieces of paper and pens and whatever other hardware with COVID-19, with the virus. And so, you know, issues like that were discussed, brought up with the consumer advisory group, and we wanted to get a sense from them as to, you know, whether they felt it was appropriate to use verbal consent or not.
And so based on the feedback you've had both from the consumer and your steering committee or the group, how do you think consumers have perhaps influenced how you've looked at your trial and how it will work, and were there any surprises in that?
Look, I think it was a very useful process in that some things were raised. So, for example, with the verbal consent, I think we've tightened up how we wanted to have that documented, and with each of the site initiation visits with site PIs, we've made it very clear that the documentation of verbal consent needs to be done very well, and that would be audited. Some issues were raised about, so we're asked within the consent and within the trial, we're asking for collection of research samples. So there was a pretty clear message that we needed to separate out the idea of joining a clinical trial from that of having research samples, so that it was clear to participants that they could participate in the clinical trial, but that did not obligate them to be providing research samples. And then I guess another thing was the issue of surrogate consent. So when we initially designed this, and everything was done, you know, fairly quickly, with our understanding that we would have lots of patients and things might be pretty rushed. But we had, as one of the exclusion criteria, was that if a participant was not able to give consent, that they were excluded and ineligible for the study. And the consumer advisory group felt that this was an issue of equity, and that patients who were, for whatever reason, did not have, you know, capacity to provide consent at that time should still be offered the opportunity to be part of the trial. So we've gone back to ethics with a methodology for getting surrogate consent if the individual did not have capacity at the time.
I think you've raised some excellent points there. Do you think based on your experience, do you think involving consumers has been a good move? Is there anything you would do differently, or any advice you'd give to someone who was trying to do this?
Yeah, look, I was really happy to involve consumers, and I think it is extremely important, and ideally comes from the start of a trial and, you know, how you design the trial and what kind of outcomes you're looking at. And I know that there's many who are doing further work in that area. So we presented the protocol and various trial materials to this consumer group that Anne runs, and we met with them by Zoom for an hour and a half or two. I think it was a Thursday evening. So that was helpful. There were times I felt when it was a bit adversarial, perhaps, rather than collaborative, and I found that part of things not as helpful. I was kind of really hoping that we would be working together to improve the research, rather than being at times feeling that we were really being, you know, heavily critiqued, which is fine, I think, but could have been done in a less personal way, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think figuring out how to work together is one of the challenges that we have in this space. So thank you, Stephen, for offering that advice. Hopefully you can hang around for a few minutes in case there's some more questions. But just in the interest of time, I do want to move on to Anne, if that's okay. And thanks for joining us today, particularly on your WA public holiday. For those who don't know Anne, she's the Manager of Community Engagement at Telethon Kids and has previously headed up the Consumer and Community Health Research Network. She's a Senior Consumer Representative for CHF and a former Chair of the Health Consumers Council of WA and serves on lots of state and national health committees. She's a member of the Order of Australia for her services. So welcome, Anne. You've been a vocal advocate and doer around consumer involvement for many years. So it's great to have you with us today.
Thanks, Janelle.
I was just wondering, can you tell us a little bit about some of the projects you've been involved in, particularly related to or initiated since the pandemic started?
Yeah, I need to go back to the beginning, and what happened was I was contacted by Tom Snelling, who is a researcher and trialist that I've been, working with at Telethon Kids for, a number of years, and I was contacted by him late March to say that he was keen to talk to consumers around a trial that he was putting together because he's now moved to Sydney. And so I was also at that time quite concerned that I was hearing about research projects, not just clinical trials, but research projects in general that had been started up that had no community involvement in them. And I was a bit concerned about this because I'm also a board member of ACTA. So I talked to my boss at Telethon Kids and then the director of Telethon Kids, Jonathan Karapetis, about perhaps setting up a group. And the difficulty was that, I work at Telethon Kids and we were looking to set up something that would have a wider use, so for researchers and trialists across Australia if necessary. So we went ahead. We didn't have any funding for this, and as you all know, who works in research institutes, philanthropic funding is a big part of the money that you bring in, and that seemed to be drying up quite rapidly at that time. So I rang 20 people from across Australia. Janelle was one of them, and invited them to sort of work with me to form a national consumer advisory group that could be driven out of Telethon Kids, but also served the needs, if asked, of collaborators of Telethon Kids. And that was a bit loose in as much as that if you'd heard of Telethon Kids, I was quite happy to work with you to include or to have access to this group of people. And this group of people is, there's 19 members. Only one person couldn't, for their own personal reasons, join the group, but there's 19 members, 3 from New South Wales, and then members from Queensland, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia, and then of course Telethon Kids. And so far the group has had input into 15 projects, and I think 7 of them are trials. We've had 8 virtual meetings, and collectively they've given over 220 hours of their time to have input into trials. And I have to say, yes, the meeting with Stephen was probably not one of the finest meetings that I've ever been involved in, but I think it was a bit tense, and well, I don't think it was, I know it was a bit tense and at times adversarial, perhaps is a good word, but people were genuinely interested in the bulk of the work that's been done. And I don't know why it was that meeting, Stephen, but we haven't had that since. But people are genuinely wanting to contribute to trials and to other research projects because nobody knows or knew what was going to happen at this time. So that's why we set it up, and 95% of the work that we've done has been very positive and I hope very helpful.
Thanks, Anne. I think that's a good summary. So for you, what have been some of the surprises and challenges in running such a group?
Well, I'm an older person, and running groups by technology has been challenging, but I'm pleased to say now that I actually feel like I am a Zoom, but I can run a Zoom and I've now learned how to mute people if they, you know, don't behave appropriately. But, you know, I think the biggest thing has been, you know, turning people's want to help into something positive for the researchers. So that's been a challenge. And I also think, you know, giving people an opportunity to have a say when you've got a very short period of time. And as you say, Janelle, it was bedtime for you and dinner time for people here in WA. So, you know, they've been some of the challenges. But, you know, the latest project that we've been working on has been the schools testing program. It is a clinical trial, and they're looking to test for asymptomatic kids and teachers in 80 or 40 schools, and I think they're going to do 150 people in each school of the 40. So, you know, it's a big amount of work, and the community advisory groups had, from particularly of West Australian people, have had huge input into, you know, the patient information and consent forms, and, you know, the support that might be needed if your child is the one child in the school that does have COVID. So they've been very helpful there in raising some of those issues.
Thanks, Anne. As a member of the group, it's been a really interesting experience for me, both as someone from the clinical trials profession, but also as someone on the other side of the fence as a potential health consumer, to contribute and hear the feedback and concerns of the group. And it's really, for me, made it quite clear why it's important that the research community engages consumers more in order to kind of build trust and maintain the support for what we do in research. I guess Stephen has actually summarised some of the key themes quite well that I've seen, things around, you know, how we obtain consent, how we support inclusion of vulnerable populations, particularly those that may be at risk, the use of technology in trials, the regular lay language needs, and the issues around consent for future samples. Would you say there's anything different in what you've seen this time in what people are kind of talking about as a result of COVID-19 compared to usual?
No, I think you've covered it really well, and I think Stephen did too. And I you know, I don't think there's been any huge issues other than the consent for future research. That continues to be a problem. Not a problem, but an issue that, you know, there's some clarity around. And I think people are always okay with things if they're discussed in the first instance and not leaving it for people, like David said, to have to chase up information. And, you know, I think if you're upfront about what you're going to do, then it certainly, you know, it makes a difference. And one other thing that's been discussed in the last few meetings we've got is, you know, what's going to happen with these trials and research projects when, you know, we don't have the case numbers. So that's been something that's been a question more than an issue.
Yeah, and I think for me, the issues that have been raised have a lot are things that I think we should start conversations on in advance to make sure that we continue to keep people's trust in how we do research. So moving forward, what do you think we can learn from this experience, and what do you think needs to happen next to support consumer involvement in clinical trials?
Well, from my perspective, I think, you know, research is always improved by having the consumer voice in it. It doesn't matter what sort of research it is, you know, from the lab-based, you know, right through to the clinical trial research that's done, you know, and I think it can always be improved because, you know, none of us know everything. So, you know, if you're talking to people who have a condition, well, of course, you know, they're going to have, you know, information that you may not have as a trialist. Even if you are a very experienced trialist and you're a doctor or whomever, you don't have all of the information about everything. So I think that it's improved. But what this has shown to me, and yes, there certainly was, you know, heated discussion with the meeting that Stephen talked about. But what I've found is that people want to be involved. They want to know, and I think this has been a time where, you know, the profile of research and particularly clinical trials and, you know, the development of vaccines, etc., has been really raised in the community's mind. So I think moving on and going forward, it's really important to sort of take advantage of that, you know, greater community knowledge, because I think, you know, I've found, and I've been working in this space for a very, very long time, that people do want to contribute and make it better for everybody. So I think you should just take advantage of what we've, you know, seen happen in a quick period of time.
And make it easy to happen. So just before I move on to any questions, and if someone wanted to engage with the National Consumer Advisory Group, how would they do that?
Well, they just need to contact me at Telethon Kids, and we can, you know, have a conversation about what the needs are and what the availability of that group is. So, yeah, I'm very happy to talk to anyone who's interested.
So, Sue, we might have a couple of minutes for questions before I pass back to Shani. Has anyone raised anything?
Yeah, hi, Janelle. There's a question for Stephen, if he's still on the line. Can you please elaborate on the process of obtaining surrogate consent?
Yeah, sure. So at the initially, our study, we could only obtain consent from the individual who is, you know, sick with COVID-19, and if that individual does not have capacity, let's say I think it was raised, if they're deaf or if they have some mental incapacity, perhaps dementia or otherwise, we were not able to include that person into the trial. So surrogate consent means that the next of kin, the medical guardian, person who has that authority, we can discuss the study with that person and obtain consent for the individual then to be able to participate in the trial.
Thank you. And there was one other question. I don't know if this is Stephen or Anne or both, but what were the issues that caused attentions that were related to adversarial?
Stephen, do you want to go first with the answer for that?
Sure. Look, I think there were some legitimate questions raised by the advisory group, and if anything, it was more to me that the tone and the way in which those issues were raised, and that was kind of aggressive and, I guess adversarial is probably a reasonable word to use there, which was not the kind of, I guess, the way that I thought we should be engaging with each other.
And just to add to that, you know, we're talking about one person who was cross or grumpy or rude. I don't know what the answer is, but we're talking about one person who had some, you know, legitimate questions, but asked them in a manner that was not productive. I don't work like that, and like you, Stephen, I was just as surprised as, you know, everybody else that was on the call. But, you know, it's all a learning experience, and when you bring together 19, you know, very experienced and consumer representatives, it's possible you might have a situation like we did. So it's a learning experience.
Can I add one thought as well? One of the things that I sit back and observe in the meetings is often how there are some key concepts in clinical trials which we as trialists take for granted, like therapeutic misconception, that are not well understood by the community. And so sometimes tensions can come away because the community has one expectation and researchers have a framework in how things are done, that causes a little bit of a clash sometimes because of a, you know, different knowledge of systems. And I think that's why it's important that we continue to educate the community about clinical trials. Not just that there should be that they should be in one, but the process around them. Any other questions, Sue?
No, Janelle, there are no other questions posted.
With that, I would like to really thank David, if he's still on the line, as well as Stephen and Anne for giving up their time today. I know there's lots going on with the Escott trial, and it's public holiday, and the sun is shining in other parts of the world. So thank you all for being part of this, and Shani, I'll kick it back to you.
Great, thanks very much, Janelle, and thanks to Janelle for chairing the session, to David, to Stephen and Anne for their very insightful points, and just I guess from the perspective of listening to the conversation, you know, people do come from different perspectives, and bringing in yet another voice to and particularly the patient voice, and I can imagine, you know, whatever background that they have or whatever experience they've had, that it can be quite distressing and be quite frustrating. So sometimes that can be an issue, but you know, I think generally everybody is really trying to work towards the same goal, and sometimes frustrated at some aspects that don't allow them to get there as quickly as possible. So look, time is run out, but thanking the speakers and Janelle for chairing today at this anchoring webinar for our COVID-19 series. I really appreciate the effort of my team in pulling this together. We, as Beck said in the beginning, we turned it around and made it happen really quite early on in the process of the COVID pandemic, and that was no mean feat, I can assure you. To organise probably in the order of 30, 35 speakers over the period is quite challenging. So look, thank you to everybody. If you have any questions after this, we will take them. I do want to make just one point of correction in what I said earlier on in relation to the company that was undertaking the clinical trial. I said Novatech. Novatech is a great CRO, but I meant to say Novavax, a company listed in the US, but running trials here in Australia. So just noting that. And I'm going to very sadly say goodbye to you all, and thank you everybody for all the hard effort. Thank you so much for our sponsors, MTP Connect. Thanks Beck. Thanks to New South Wales Health. Shelley, thank you for your contributions and supporting us, I think, in this very important series of webinars that support our members and the broader stakeholders. So thank you so much, and goodbye.